So our passage time this morning, we're going to be reading from John. And I'm going to be reading from a few different sections in the book of John. If any of the youth want to go, that's awesome. Good. So we're going to be reading from a couple different sections in John. So the first is going to be from John 13, starting in verse 37, and it reads this way. Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. This is the next section. So that 37 and 38 were from John 13. Then in John chapter 18, we have this. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of the man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. And he replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself, so they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" And he denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" And again Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow. Afterward, this is in John 21, afterward Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. Thank you. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and the 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals. There were fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." Then the 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" And Jesus answered, "If you want him to remain alive until I return, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is this to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that the disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have enough room for the books that would be written. We are continuing through our series thinking about the people who took part specifically in the death of Christ. And we are going to spend a couple minutes this morning thinking about Peter, who, even though he was a great friend and he was actually a ministry partner with Jesus, he did betray Jesus. Peter was one of the disciples that was closest to Jesus. He was part of, sometimes people call it the inner circle. He was someone who prided himself on being at the forefront of Jesus' ministry. He was the only one who actually willingly jumped out of the boat in order to walk with Jesus on the water. He was the one who also jumped up and cut off the guard's ear when Jesus was arrested in the garden. Of all the disciples, Peter was the one that you never would have guessed would have been the one to betray Jesus, to deny even knowing him. Peter didn't even believe Jesus when Jesus warned him that this is what was going to take place. During the same time that Jesus was warning that Judas was going to hand him over to be arrested, Peter proclaimed his undying fealty to Christ. He was adamant that even if everyone else fell away, Peter would hold fast. Instead, Jesus let Peter know that very night, just within a matter of hours of them having this meal and this conversation, Peter was going to deny even knowing Jesus, not once, not twice, but 3 times. As we go through this series of the betrayers of Jesus, we begin with considering, how does Jesus respond to Peter in the face of him being betrayed? He was being betrayed by one of his closest friends. This was one of the people who was supposed to help him, supposed to take care of him. But here, in the time where Jesus actually needs him, in his hour of vulnerability, this is when Peter turns his back and denies even knowing him. All of the times when Jesus helped Peter, Jesus taught him, Jesus counseled him, Jesus cared for him, he fed him. Jesus had untold patience and untold effort that he poured out into Peter's life. And when Jesus needed him most, when he was most in need, that is when he was abandoned by Peter. And I noticed 2 important things in how Jesus responds to this. The first is that Jesus doesn't underreact or overreact. Jesus doesn't make it okay, nor does he blow it out of proportion. As Jesus knows what is going to take place, he is actively warning Peter. And then he listens to Peter deny that he's going to be able to do this. He listens to Peter deny that it's going to take place. But Jesus doesn't react the way most of us would. He doesn't lash out, nor does he make it seem like it's not that big of a deal. Jesus lets Peter know what will happen, and that's it. And I find this to be very out of sync with how many of us would respond in the situation. When we see someone we care about who has either just made a mistake or is about to make a mistake imminently, we usually have 2 reactions. One is to overreact, to be angry, to just let loose with our disappointment, to spill it out in a torrent of frustration directed at the person in order to try to maybe just get them to not do what they're about to do. Or sometimes we underreact. We don't really want to make them feel worse than they already feel. We want to try to allay the damage by giving them some kind of encouragement. So we try to say, oh, it's not that big of a deal, even if it really is. Jesus doesn't overreact, and he doesn't underreact. Instead, he simply speaks the truth and then lets it be. The second thing Jesus does is the same thing that he did for Judas. Even with the knowledge of what these people were about to do to him, even though with this knowledge that his trusted friend was about to deny even knowing him, Jesus washes Peter's feet. He feeds him at the table, he prays for him, and he chooses to bring him along to the garden where he is going to be arrested. And then after the trial, as Jesus is hanging on the cross, Jesus pays this ultimate sacrifice, not only for the ones who stood faithful by him, but for all of those who betrayed him, even with their direct actions. Jesus sacrifices his very life for the ones who did turn their back on him, like Peter. Our next consideration that we have been thinking about as we go through these stories is to consider what we might share in common with Peter. It seemed unfathomable to Peter that it could possibly happen, that he would fall away, that he would succumb to this temptation, and that he would make this kind of mistake. After all, look at everything that Peter had done and given up over these 3 years that he had ministered with Jesus. He did everything that he could do. Peter was at the forefront of Jesus' ministry. He was one of the leaders. He was one of the chosen. He was one of the strong ones. Surely there must have been some kind of mistake. Surely not me, Peter probably thought to himself. How much more can I identify with this? This is something that I can identify with. When I look at the things I've done, when I look at how much I do all the time, I think surely I couldn't possibly be the one to make a colossal mistake, especially when I look at others who make those mistakes. Surely I must somehow have enough on my side to keep me safe from being the one who is going to let God down. But this is never the case. And if we look at the history of those who have been great leaders of the faith, there are so many that have fallen so low that it is proof that there is no one who is safe from this kind of fall. We are all capable of being the one to turn away when it is most needed. There is a story of Peter written by Frederick Buechner that I find a humanizing story and portrayal of Peter, and I'm going to share it with you this morning. And it reads like this. Everybody knows Peter started out as a fisherman. He lived with his wife in Capernaum, where they shared a house with his mother-in-law and his brother Andrew. He and Andrew had their own boat and were in business with a couple of partners named James and John, Zebedee's sons. The first time Jesus laid eyes on him, he took one good look and said, "So, you're Simon, the son of John," and then said that from then on he'd call him Cephas, which is Aramaic for Peter, which is Greek for rock. A rock isn't the prettiest thing in creation, or the fanciest, or the smartest, and if it gets rolling in the wrong direction, watch out. But there's no nonsense about a rock, and once it settles down, it's pretty much there to stay. There's not a lot you can do to change a rock, or to crack it, or to get under its skin, and barring earthquakes, you can depend on it as much as you can depend on anything. So Jesus called him the rock. And it stuck with him for the rest of his life. Peter the rock. He could stop fishing for fish, Jesus told him. He had been promoted. From there on out, people were to be his business. Now he could start fishing for them. There was a lot of talk going around about who Jesus was and who he wasn't, and Jesus himself seemed just as glad to steer clear of the subject. Then one day he brought it up himself, and the disciples batted it around for a while. There were some people who said he was John the Baptist come back from the grave. They told him, or maybe Elijah, or Jeremiah, or some other prophet who thought he'd see what he could do a second time around. There were all kinds of half-baked theories, they said. Then Jesus put it to them straight. Who do you say I am? Nobody wanted to stick his neck out, and the silence was deafening until Peter broke it, or till it washed up against the rock that Peter was, and it broke itself. You're the Christ, he said, the Son of the living God. Took a lot of guts to say, and Jesus knew it did. If it was true, it was enough to blow the lid off of everything. If it wasn't true, you could get stoned yourself to death as a blasphemer for just thinking it. But Peter said it anyway, and Jesus made up for him the only beatitude he ever made up for a single individual when he said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah," which means Simon, son of John, and seems to have been what he was always called him when he really meant business. Then he went back to Peter the rock again and told him that he was the rock he wanted to build his church on, and that as soon as they got to heaven, he was to be the one to decide who else got in. I will give you the keys of the kingdom, Jesus said. It was another promotion. But if Peter was the only one Jesus ever gave a beatitude of his own, then he was also the only one he ever gave hell to, or at least in quite such a direct way. It happened not long afterwards. Jesus was saying that to be the Christ, the Son of the living God, wasn't going to be a bed of roses all the way, and time wasn't far off until he'd suffer the tortures of the damned in Jerusalem and be killed. Peter couldn't take it. "God forbid, Lord, that this shall never happen," he said. And that is when Jesus lit into him. "Get behind me, Satan," he said, because the rock that Peter was at that point was blocking the grim road that Jesus knew he had to take. Whatever he or Peter or anybody else wanted it or not, this was the way it had to be, and that was that. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." It wasn't the last time Peter said the wrong thing either, or asked the wrong question, or got the wrong point, or at least failed to do the thing that was right. The day he saw Jesus walking on the water and tried to walk out on it himself, for instance, he was just about to go under for the third time because rocks have never been very good at floating, when Jesus came to the rescue. Once when Jesus was talking about forgiveness, Peter asked, "How many times are you supposed to forgive any one person? 7 times maybe?" And Jesus turned on him and said that after you've forgiven him 70 times 7, you were just starting to get warmed up. Another time, Jesus was talking about heaven, and Peter wanted to know what sort of special deal people like himself got. People who'd left home and given everything up the way he'd given everything up to follow Jesus. And Jesus took it easy on him that time, because a rock can't help but being a little thick sometimes, and said he'd get plenty, and so would everybody else. And then there was the things he did or failed to do. Those final miserable days just before the end. At their Last Supper, when Jesus started to wash the disciples' feet, it was Peter who protested, "You wash my feet?" And then Jesus explained that it showed how they were all part of each other and servants together. And Peter said, "Lord, not my feet only, but my hands and my head," and would probably have stripped down to the altogether if Jesus hadn't stopped him in time. At the same sad meal, Jesus said he would be having to be going soon. And because Peter didn't get what he meant or couldn't face it, he asked about it, and Jesus explained what he meant was that he was going where nobody on earth could follow him. Peter finally got the point then and asked why he couldn't follow. "I'll lay down my life for you," he said. And then Jesus said to him the hardest thing Peter had ever heard him say. "Listen," he said, "the cock won't crow until you've betrayed me 3 times. And that it was that way, of course. Peter sitting out there in the high priest courtyard, keeping warm by the fire, while inside the ghastly interrogation was in process. And then this girl comes out to ask him 3 times if he wasn't one of them, and his reply each time that he didn't know what in God's name she was talking about. And then the old cock's waddle, trembling scarlet as up above the horizon it squawked the rising sun, and the tears running down Peter's face like rain down a rock. According to Paul, the first person Jesus came back to see after Easter morning was Peter. What he said and what Peter said, nobody will ever know, and maybe that's just as well. Their last conversation on this earth, however, was reported in the Gospel of John. It was on the beach at daybreak. Some of the other disciples were there, and Jesus cooked them breakfast. When it was over, he said to Peter, only again he called him Simon, son of John, because if he ever meant business, this was it. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter said he did. Then Jesus asked him the same question a second time, and then once again, and each time Peter said he loved him, 3 times in all, to make up for the 3 other times. Then Jesus said, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep." And you get the feeling that this time Peter didn't miss the point. From fish to fisher of people, to keeper of the keys, to shepherd. It was the rock's final promotion, and from that day forward, he never let the head office down again. Just like our examination of when Jesus was betrayed by religion, that discussion that we had should have made us feel uncomfortable as a group. And then reading about how Jesus is betrayed by one of those who are closest to him should make us experience some discomfort too. Because this story is one that doesn't leave us in a place of guilt and shame, but it should remind us of what we are capable of, no matter how close we may feel to God. This is ultimately a story of hope, though, and in this story, more than the others, we can see why. We sometimes speak about the idea of Jesus offering restorative justice instead of punitive justice, and this story of Peter is a key example of what that means. Punitive justice is when we offer a negative punishment to those who fail or make a mistake. It's to deter those who might fall to not want to do it again, and it punishes people to not want to make mistakes in the first place. While there is perhaps some benefit to this some of the time, the truth is that this kind of justice, more often than not, just leads to a weaker state for people, to be more inclined to make more mistakes. Punitive justice is better in an environment that prizes that no one should make mistakes in the first place. But restorative justice is different. It is the idea that we build up a person to help them not fall again. And not to just make them feel better. Remember, that's not what Jesus did here. He didn't diminish the betrayal that Peter was going to do in order to make him feel better. Instead, he did offer Peter a path back to where he needed to be in order to learn from his mistake and to do better. We can somehow give ourselves this misguided notion that somehow Peter must have been special, that Jesus offered this scenario to Peter alone because it was just something special about Peter. But that's not the case. This concept of restorative justice is what Jesus offers to anyone and to all, anyone who would accept his grace. He does not hold out restorative justice to some, but then punitive justice to everyone else. He is offering restorative justice to anyone who would accept it. And this is the final thought that I have, especially as I think about a comparison between Judas and Peter. So many ways we see them as being two very different things, two similar ways of people who betrayed Jesus, how they started out. The beginning of the story is very similar, but the end is vastly different for both of them. And I find myself asking why. What is the difference that Peter is allowed to have Jesus grant him forgiveness, but Judas doesn't, his story doesn't end that way? What is the thing that is separating them? Frederick Buechner, the same author that wrote that portrayal of Peter, also writes this description of what the good news is. And he says this: the gospel is bad news before it is good news, and it is the news that man is a sinner. But it is also the news that he is loved anyway, cherished, forgiven, bleeding to be sure, but also bled for. So what if even in his sin, the slob is loved and forgiven, when the very mark and substance of his sin and his slobbery is that he keeps turning down the love and forgiveness because he either doesn't believe it, doesn't want it, or just doesn't give a damn? And I find this thought to be something that's significant, because how often is that the case for us? That in our sin, we choose to ignore, not believe, or not want the forgiveness that can offer restoration and restore us back to a place of serving God. So many ways, this quote is something that sums up the hope that we have. There is tragedy in the fact that we are sinners. There's tragedy in the sense that sin entered into the world and broke our position with God. But the tragedy is not just that happened. The tragedy is not just the story of the fall in the garden with Adam and Eve, because that is tragic for sure, but that's the far worse tragedy, is that the offer of salvation from that place can be ignored, or it can be doubted, or it can just be left and never taken. The quote that was read this morning is just a stark reminder that the real tragedy that takes place is when this promise of restoration is offered freely, but never accepted and allowed to do its work. Everyone has betrayed Jesus in one way or another. We all have. But this doesn't end there. The story doesn't end there, because we have hope in knowing that we can find justice and that we can be forgiven, able to begin a life of abundant healing, to allow restoration that truly changes who we are, that we can move beyond a fallen state if we simply allow ourselves to encounter that restorative grace in the gospel of Christ. Please join me as we pray. God, we are grateful for the comfort we can find in reading about real people and how they responded, not only how they responded in their sin and brokenness, but how they responded to your grace and your offering of restorative justice, your offering to come back in a way that doesn't diminish nor makes it impossible for us to come back from that place of brokenness and mistakenness, God. None of us are beyond that capability. Every single one of us has betrayed you and has the capability of doing it again. But that's not where we're left. You have offered us your restorative grace to offer us healing, to offer us life that is beyond, life that is abundant and full. God, you've offered to restore us. And we ask that we have the bravery and we have the tenacity to be able to enter into that season, to enter into that journey, to be willing to follow you in a way that we do not forget, to follow you in a way that we put you first, beyond our desires, beyond our expectations, and beyond our pride. We pray for this in your name. Amen.